Hello, today I want to talk about my book, The Two Virtuals, which is coming out this summer from Parlor Press. I've been working on it for a while and I'm pretty excited about it. And I want to focus specifically on this notion that's in the title of the two virtuals. So what might those two virtuals be? Well, the first one is one that I think is fairly well known and recognizable, and that would be the virtual reality of modern computing. Right, it's the virtual reality of Second Life, of video games, the virtual spaces of the desktop, the computer desktop, or the internet, and so on. And so it's this whole kind of what we often think of anyway as a kind of second reality, as is suggested by Second Life, right? So it's this kind of second space that we inhabit in one way or another. The other virtual is one that is probably less familiar, but has a longer history. It's a kind of minor philosophical tradition that goes back to Greek philosophers and to medieval philosophers like Duns Scotus and to people like Spinoza and Leibniz and Bergson and so on, and then certainly up to people like Deleuze and Guattari, whose notion of the virtual largely gave me entrance into thinking about this idea. And the virtual really hovers at the periphery of more familiar concepts in postmodernism and poststructuralism like deconstruction and the rhizome and deterritorialization and simulation and things like that. And really, as I argue in my book, what the philosophical virtual offers us is an alternate idea about how we get from nothing to something. That is, if we think that the sort of fundamental philosophical question is why is there something rather than nothing, we have a kind of dominant answer to that question that we can certainly follow forward through Western philosophy. That is kind of a philosophy of essentialism, right? In one way or another, and even when we look at science, although certainly we look at physics and concepts that certainly most of us barely understand, and I won't claim to have any great understanding of. There's these ideas start to fall apart. But generally, the way that we look at the world has been to look for essential characteristics, essential laws that govern the ways that objects come together and why there is something rather than nothing, and what those different things are in essentially different ways, right? That we have different categories of animals and plants and objects and so forth, and they're all separated from one another by their essential characteristics, right? So we have that sort of dominant philosophical tradition. But the philosophy of the virtual offers us a different way of looking at how materiality that is kind of undifferentiated in some sense ends up forming different things. Right? So it's really a theory of composition, if you like, and that's what I like, and that's what I'm looking at in this book, right? The way that this concept of the virtual informs, or might inform anyway, our ideas about composition. And that certainly intersects back with the other virtual, the technological virtual, because certainly for the last, 30 years, almost 30 years, we've been looking at computers and writing in one way or another, although one could certainly argue that it's only been in the last dozen years or so since the rise of the internet that we've looked in a really serious and dedicated way at how networking and computers affect the ways that we compose texts. And certainly it's only been in the same period of time that we've really thought seriously about multimedia composition in our field of rhetoric and composition. And that's in some ways understandable, since it's only been in that period of time that these things have become, technologically feasible for the average faculty member, let alone the average student. So given the rise of computing, we have started to think about how technology shapes writing. And when we talk about technology in rhetoric and composition, we almost always mean computers or things that are computer related. Although clearly we recognize that writing is itself inherently technological, whether it's a chisel on a piece of stone or whether it's quill or pencil and paper or typewriter. These things are all technologies. We realize those things. It's just that we haven't really thought about composition in a technological way um, until the rise of the computer. At least has not really been at all a central focus to how we've thought about the writing process. Now, what happens, of course, is that now that we start to think about the technological as part of writing, we need to have a theory about how does technology intersect with all the other parts of the compositional process, and specifically, our traditional ideas about authorship and invention and intellectual property, copyright. These notions that here I am the author, I do the typing, I come up with the ideas, right? They are my ideas. What role can we offer for technology in that process where I am still the author and so on? And obviously those ideas become even more greatly complicated as we see more inherently collaborative processes of composition, like Wikipedia being the one that everybody talks about. So we have that kind of problem that is exacerbated by technology, right? The way our sort of narrative and ideology about authorship is deeply troubled by the appearance of technology, and it's forcing us to acknowledge a role for technology in composition. And so that kind of problem that is raised by technology is in some ways answered, although not solved, but answered in an interesting way by this theory of the virtual, which allows us to think about composition in a very different way. And this is kind of what my book talks about, because we can see these sort of the challenges of the virtual as a kind of underpinning for postmodern and poststructural theory. Interweaves in surprising ways with the development of virtual technologies, with media technologies. That is, we can go back like Kittler has and see how the typewriter and the gramophone and the camera all challenge our notions of authorship and identity and subjectivity by fragmenting the composition, the processes of thought, and forcing us to look at ourselves in uncanny ways. And Hales does a similar thing. Catherine Hales does a similar thing, looking at the history of cybernetics, which is the other kind of technological wing to virtual reality. Right? We have media on one side and computing on the other, and they kind of come together to create virtual reality as a technology. So Hales kind of shows us the struggles that cyberneticists had with trying to deal with the implications that their theories had for human intelligence, and how that develops through autopoiesis in the 60s and 70s, and into artificial life and artificial intelligence and theories of distributed cognition and so on that we see at work today. And so those ideas all kind of come together in interesting ways with theories of philosophical theories of virtuality. And what they ultimately give rise to in my book is thinking about the processes of composition as a process of distributed cognition that is cybernetic, cyborgian, I suppose you could say, that it's an intersection of embodied cognitive processes and external networks of information and media, and how those things kind of come together in a process which gives rise to textual production, right? How thoughts kind of emerge through these intersections of technological, material, embodied processes, and how thoughts sort of rise into the consciousness, are named and identified and put to work for various ends, ultimately for various ideological ends. How that process all kind of works in a way that is, I think, very different from how we conventionally map the processes of composition. And then so the book really kind of works in thirds. The first third kind of looks at the technology aspect of it, the history of the technology. Again, there's a chapter that kind of deals with the evolution of writing. And then there's a chapter that deals with the development of media technologies in the 19th century through the early 20th century. there's a chapter that deals with cybernetics, and then a chapter that deals with the development of digital cinema, which kind of combines media technologies and cybernetics. So that makes up the first third or so, at least conceptually, the first third of the book. The second third then looks at the philosophical virtual concept, sort of explains that, looks at it in terms of, I look really at the matrix and I look at some other things, but I talk about, so I kind of use some media as examples of looking at of exploring how this philosophical virtual explains the development of materiality, and specifically the development of cognition, and then the arising of thought. And then in the last third, I look at how these things give point towards a certain way of understanding compositional practices, and I borrow the rip, mix, and burn concept from Lessig and others, talking about the way that we use the internet and media on the internet, that we rip content from places and we mix it together to create our own new compositions, and then we burn those so that we can then share them with others. And I sort of use that concept as a way of talking about the processes of thought themselves, that cognition sort of begins with ripping information from the infoscape, whether that's through our senses or through our interaction with media, text, or whatever. We rip information, we mix that information together, that's the kind of cognitive process that we go through, and that we certainly rely on computers to do some of that mixing, and other technologies to do some of that mixing, and that our eyes do some of that mixing and filtering, and other sensory organs do some of that mixing and filtering, and then it certainly comes into our brain where we mix it some more, and out of that mixing process, thoughts are burned. And then those burned thoughts then become opportunities for further mixing, ripping, and so forth. So there's a kind of recursive process that works in a kind of fractal way, I guess, so that you could see ripping, mixing, and burning at various levels going on and on. And so anyway, so I sort of talk about that compositional concept. And then I talk about how that might work in a pedagogical way. I talk about some of the pedagogical practices that might be associated with a rip, mix, burn composition. And certainly I draw on Ulmer and his ideas of electracy and things, because there's definitely some very close connections there to what he's doing. And I end by looking at some of the broader implications, I guess, for higher education, and how this approach to thinking about technology and networks and so on might be a fruitful way for rhetoric anyway to situate itself in relation to the changing role that higher education plays in this globalizing and increasingly technological culture in which we live. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what the book is about. So I think I've definitely been going on long enough for today, but I will come back at some point this summer and talk a little bit more in detail about some of the chapters in the book. But I hope maybe that's enough to get you interested and want to have you take a look at it. All right, take care.